Hello and welcome to the dark side. We are so happy that you join us, that you watch this back, and that you engage in our topics. We're really delighted to bring you episode 3 of the Dark Side season 4. We've been doing this for a while now. We love it. We enjoy it. How you doing, Mr. Storm?
I'm great. I'm always great. It's a consequence of my birth.
Well, good. Okay, for the rest of us, we'll just get on with this evening. All right, let's get straight to it, people. The news highlights for this week. Which stories are we going to cover? There are 3 main stories that we're covering today. The first story is the news about a British black woman who has basically caught her co-workers being racist on a racist rant. So in effect, she forgets her phone is recording. She goes to the toilet. She comes back a little bit later in the day or that weekend. She's like, oh, my phone was recording while I was away. And these colleagues were using racist tropes, diatribe, the usual kind of nonsense that you talk about. Oh, doesn't she smell funny? I mean, she's not here right now, but doesn't she smell funny? I think that's cocoa butter. Black people kind of smell like cocoa butter. I mean, they don't wash their hair, black women, and all of this nonsense. The irony of which, of course, is all of that is said about every race. There are people that smell a certain kind of way, and there are people that don't wash. And this is said frequently about all kinds of people. It's not endemic. It's not it's not human. I'm not saying that this woman didn't wash, but it's not a human trait to not wash. It's quite interesting. It's an interesting thing, but basically the long and short of it is this really stressed her out to know that every time she left a room, basically her colleagues are, could be conspiring and talking about her behind her back, making her feel awful. It stressed her to the point that she actually quit her job in the end and is looking for other work because she couldn't take it anymore. This got picked up around the world. And I think the reason that it gets picked up around the world is because while not particularly shocking to a British person, it's not like I haven't heard this before. I think sometimes people don't realize that British racism is as loud as that. Like people talk about British racism being more subtle, it's more institutional, it has more of a systemic feel, and it does. It has all of those, or it's microaggressions, it's very low level, but it also is 2 colleagues standing nearby your desk having a chit chat and then turn to, she smells, innit? She's just, black people are just, why don't they wash their hair? What's wrong with black women and not washing their hair? Ew. It's as blatant as that, those stereotypes. So, Mr. Storm, add you back to the stream now, I think. Is there something you would like to add to this? Macaron, obviously. That's what you'd like to add to the whole conversation. I'm eating a lovely macaron on a Sunday afternoon, and the British are doing their usual racist tropes.
Listen, I'm just here carrying on drinking my coffee and eating my macaron because it's business as usual for the British. What you want me to say?
Yeah.
They getting on with their racism. I getting on with my coffee. Life goes on. This is business as usual for them. A lot of people be like, well, but maybe she smells, maybe. Okay, maybe she does. The problem with this is that they attributed the reason for her smelling to her blackness.
Right. Talking this now.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is where the problem occurs. She wasn't smelling because she's a smelly person. She was smelling because black people smell.
Right.
And so that's where we cross the line into racism. I'm like, if they said she smells, maybe she does. I don't know her. She could. Look, the reality is, You know, I've
And
met
it's not
plenty of
above people
people.
to smell from time to time, like, and people have various smells, and women particularly. What I find interesting is that women particularly can go through seasons of hormonal shifts that will shift their own scent. So all women know this is possible, but yet still you're going to attribute this to the color of her skin and not to her being just human. Like, and that just being a fact of life, that sometimes you have a run of bad luck, a bad patch, blah blah blah, because you're black. I mean, what? That doesn't like, it's because
Look,
I'm human. Like, all humans suffer this problem.
I think I think we people need to understand is that British people are not as quick to call you the N word
No, 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 no,
as people from the US are.
no. Yeah.
And that you're absolutely right to say that British racism tends to be a lot more insidious.
Hmm.
So you see it played out in this where they will talk about how she smells and then attribute that to her blackness. You're more likely than not to face racism in that way. And that's not to say that British people are not familiar with the use of the N word and don't employ it when they are good and ready. It's just that it tends not to be their first port of call.
No, no, they tend, but and again, that's a cultural thing. When we talk about Britishness, that's a cultural. It's a very cultural thing. Whereas you might talk about, let's, if we talked about stereotypes, you talk about the brash American, you would talk about the polite British. And so that cultural stereotype, that cultural value and normative, even, and you see it played out in the House of Commons. So for those of you who like politics, you see it played out. You know, you can say a lot of things in the House of Commons, but you can't call names and you can't do all of those things that that would call the house into disrepute. But you will hear them insult each other in the most beautiful and fanciful ways. But underneath it, they just they call you like it in a, they're calling you an idiot. Like, they can make it sound pretty, but they're calling you an idiot effectively. So there is a cultural nuance to this, and it doesn't mean that they don't use all of those words. I was just about to do the same thing as you. It is that they use them in a different way. So Jean Noel has commented that he'll go further to say that some racism are innate genetic. So I think the point that you're driving at there is that they kind of, they've bought the lie in essence that it's that
I don't know.
the
I'd like you to explain that statement further, Jean Noel, because I'm not sure quite sure what you mean by the genetic aspect of that.
is it that the racists are innately blaming
I don't know.
genetics, or is it that
I need further
yeah,
clarification on that. I'm
okay.
not quite.
Well, let's see how it goes. Let's see how he clarifies, and then we'll see. But yeah, it's an interesting story. I found it quite interesting that it got picked up by American news, simply because I think it shows the ever-changing world and landscape that we're in. We both watched Roy Wood Jr.'s comedy where he talks about the fact that Americans aren't taught their own history, let alone understanding that the diaspora of Black people outside of the USA suffering in their own ways that can be comparable to the Black experience in the USA, and the ignorance that they have around that. So I found it quite interesting that is maybe the balance is tipping, and that news medias or news commentators out there are beginning to pick up news stories, especially if you're within the diaspora and you're trying to promote a Black Lives Matter or an anti-racism perspective, that they're beginning to pick up news stories that link these people. They're beginning to link these people in the whole diaspora and not just the American narrative. So I thought it was quite interesting that it's picked up by by news media. I understand this perspective. I'll explain it, but not right now. I get this. Typing on a screen can be difficult. Let me say that. Sometimes you don't have all the time in the world to type your comments, but you're enjoying the conversation, and thank you for joining us, Jean Noel. We are happy that you are with us and that you are part of our conversation. So thank you very much. And we look forward to having a longer conversation with you at some other time. All right, so that was our first news story. Our second news story for today, I want to talk about a problem that has spanned Europe but is now being picked up in Portugal. So in Portugal, there is a 200 million pound berry industry. So if you like your soft fruits, your
Strawberries, raspberries, blackberries,
etc. This industry exists largely or has a base in Portugal. And what's being happened is that they are recruiting people for the industry abroad. Surprise, surprise. We had this same problem in the UK, that the locals don't want to pick the fruit, but they will import other people to do it because they are going to pay them less than minimum wage, make them work 16 hours a day in 40-degree heat, and basically hold them to ransom with the threat that if you don't do this, we will forfeit your visa and deport you or put you in jail or any of the above kind of punitive measures. And so this has been investigated by a British newspaper called The Guardian, who I think looked into similar working practices in the UK when this was happening in the UK. And the UK is still suffering because of Brexit, not being able to have their workforce. But in Portugal, there's particularly hitting people from Asia. That's where they're targeting. So Indonesians and others are being targeted so that they can get their passport, their European passport. But in order to do that, you have to do 5 years of slave labor, basically less than minimum wage, 16 hours a day, 40-degree heat. This is reminiscent of other things. The only thing they're not doing is tying you up with chains and shackles and beating the crap out of you, it seems like. But what they are doing is telling you that if you try and form a union, they will they threaten the workers. So they don't. They've only managed, in the time that the particular union workers were trying to get unionize the workforces so that they could protect their pay and get them better working conditions, they only managed to get 12 people out of the some 10,000 people who work in these conditions. So obviously they have power. Yes. So here's the thing. 5 years. Basically, the rule is that when you land in Portugal, from the time you get your temporary visa and you pay taxes consistently for 5 years, you have to never miss a tax payment for 5 years. You have to have a set employment record. You are then able to apply for your Portuguese passport. This is a way of getting, of course, residency in a country and getting work and better living standards for your family. And of course, one of the countries they're targeting is Indonesia. Now, if you know the Indonesian history, this is particularly poignant because the Indonesian were colonized by the Dutch, and they have generally especially the last few years, I've witnessed firsthand the pressures that Indonesians are on, even though they'll be invited to work or allowed to study in the Netherlands, they are deported. They are put under pressure to leave immediately, despite the Dutch colonizing their country and doing some of the same said things they do across the globe, depleting their resources, etc., etc., the brain drain, all of the above, treated the people abominably. And so targeting them particularly for European passport is particularly, what's the word I'm looking for, Mr. Storm? It's particularly brutal in a way, because these are people who have a relationship to Europe but are treated incredibly badly by their colonizers. So for Portugal to kind of thank you. I was looking for a word. Egregious. Thank you very much. I'm so glad that people help me on here. I'm so happy you're with us. Yeah, it's particularly egregious. Because of their history, and that maybe is for another dark side, but because of their history is particularly egregious. But then to put them into effective slave labor, there are people that they were interviewing that came from India, and they were talking about their they feel like they're less than nothing. They left for a better life, the promise of actually being able to earn money to support their family. These are people who pay their taxes, who are working people, who want to actually participate and live a life. And then they're forced into fruit farms, paying them less than minimum wage. And bear in mind that when we say less than minimum wage isn't a living wage. It's like the bare minimum a company can pay you to do work, and they're being paid less than that. It's really awful. Anyway, Mr. Storm, any thoughts on this story?
Yeah, look, just gonna say that this is par for the course. Racism and hypocrisy go hand in hand. I would say this: compare what is happening, because I believe you can draw direct parallels between what is happening in Portugal and the World Cup in Qatar.
Okay, pray tell.
Right. So this is where workers have gone to a foreign country. The employers hold on to their passports or important documents.
Oh
So
yeah.
they are effectively, and what has happened is they have gone into foreign countries, Asian countries in particular, um, seeking workers for hard labor, for jobs that their own people don't want to do or they don't have enough people to do. And then they treat the workers that come in dreadfully.
Sounds like
The
Windrush.
workers come there seeking better life, better money, better working conditions, and are met with the exact opposite. Oftentimes, when you hear people speak of their stories, they say, "I would have been better off back in my own country." You've got the death of some workers um, who have been working on the stadiums, and I'm pretty sure that if you dig deep enough, you'll find deaths of workers out in the fields through the heat stroke, poor living conditions, malnutrition, dehydration, etc., etc., etc. But there's silence on what's happening in Portugal. Right now, hearing this, look, I'm going to take the same approach to Portugal that I did with South Africa. I will not be buying anything that comes out of Portugal. Simple as. It's me one where I spend my finances isn't going to make much of a difference. However, it's what I can do,
Yeah,
and that will be hard because
we have soft fruit
my
loving
storms
children.
love berries.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I have to make a stand against this,
Right.
and the reality is that, people are staying silent on this. This is happening in Europe. This is effectively slave labor. But European countries are all too quick to point the finger at Qatar, saying, don't go to Qatar, boycott Qatar because of what has been happening to the workers that they've brought over to Qatar. But nobody's saying boycott Portugal.
Yeah. Yeah. They're not holding them to account and saying, come on, this is wrong. But they didn't hold the British to account, who were doing, similar things when they were in Europe, in the European Union, I should say. They're still Europe, but when they were in the Union, again, still not doing that. They don't hold each other to account for the working practices within their countries. One of the reasons actually why Britain wanted out is so that they could be even more egregious than they were being before. But maybe a podcast for a talk for another time. I don't know. Maybe. Well, that's our story. That's our second story. Our third story is probably the largest story out of Europe, but I want to look at it from a slightly different angle because I will say upfront, my Eastern European politics is not the best. It's not the worst, but it's also not the best. And so I kind of tiptoe into Eastern European politics very cautiously and carefully. But the Ukrainian situation is obviously on the forefront of all news media in Europe. It is a story that is it garners the news around the world. And what I want to mention here today is the German aspect of it. Now, if you've been following the story, one thing you will have noticed is that Germany is refusing to arm the Ukrainians. So this week there's been talk of the British being, arming the Ukrainians to defend themselves and so on and so forth throughout Europe. But Germany have refused to arm them. And there are a number of reasons. So there's a number of layers to this, and I just want to unpack. And I want Storm to kind of step in and help me with this, because it's not the easiest to unpack, because there are so many layers to the story. But I do want to give you a sense of the complexity of what we're dealing with, and also the threat that it's posed to the whole entire region. So the first thing to say is that by and large, Germans are, since World War II, have been known to be pacifist. And by pacifists, what that means is they do not want to enter into another war again. That is their version of pacifism, because there will be people who understand very quickly that that doesn't mean they avoid violence. It means that they avoid war. And so they do not arm conflict zones. They have a strict political policies, strict policies for their country, strict rules that they've created. That means that if there is a conflict zone, they will not be using weapons from Germany. That's how it goes. So get your weapons before you start a war, so that you understand the kind of conflicts that will happen, because they are a huge arms producer. They're not as big as Russia, UK, or America, but they still produce a large number of arms. So they have a refusal to do that. They then have a policy of diplomacy being the most active route. So they really want to ensure that the diplomatic route is the main route that they follow, and they try to do this. Now, there is a history here of a relationship between the Germans and the Russians, and this goes back to the World War II. And this particular region in Eastern Germany, there is a real concrete history. There's a place you can visit to understand why Germans would have a no war policy that they have. So at the end of World War II, coming to the end, they're fighting. Hitler is bunkered down in Berlin. The forces from Russia are coming through, and they are advancing into Eastern Germany, taking victories as they win. But the Nazi forces had taken a place of advantage, a high, place of advantage. My partner in crime is stepped out for a minute, so I'm trying to use words. So they've taken a high place of advantage. So as the forces come in, is what's described as a complete bloodbath. Now, through sheer volume, Russia still manages to win, but 30,000, it's estimated 30,000 Russians died in Silo Heights, and there's a memorial there that you can go and see. So you can imagine that when the Iron Curtain fell and that communism took over in that region, there is a real reluctance to enter into another bloodbath between the countries. 30,000, that's just the Russians, not to mention all the Germans that would have died during that time, that actually died on that ground. And the ground, apparently, if you churn the ground, so if you actually tried to farm, it literally is bones and weapons. It's literally living history. And so the people of that region don't want to enter into that. It's also why Angela Merkel would be able to talk fluently with Putin, because she was taught Russian in that part of Germany, and so was able to talk fluently with him and able to kind of broker the peace and make good relationships. However, having said all of that, the other countries are angry with the Germans because you want to go down the diplomacy route, but you're not playing all of the diplomatic hands that you have. So there is the Russian pipeline that is due to bring gas into Europe. That could be arguably shut down. It's a private enterprise, according to the reports that I read, and it's just going to be making Russian oligarchs more money. and therefore you could shut it down, and you could say that it's not going to open. You could say it's not going to open for environmental reasons. I mean, piping gas is probably, we're all trying to be a bit more green and transform our energy situations, but we also understand there's an energy crisis in Europe. So the pressure is kind of half-hearted. There are high energy prices in Europe. There is real demand for a new gas supply. This could be a solution to that, but if it is a solution to that, then you're doing it at the expense of the Ukrainian people. So there is this half talk happening. So I think it's good to to talk about these issues and the devastating effect that they could have on people's lives in Ukraine, because Ukraine should be able to be self determining as a country, and not be annexed, i.e. Crimea, not have Russia just come in because they're bigger and stronger and just decimate them as a country. But there are all these layers of the story happening that I think it's good for us just to mention here on the dark side, that we are aware of other politics. So I'm going to bring the Storm in, because he has a lot to say about this, more than I do.
Yeah, what you want me to say?
Oh, what are your thoughts on this whole Ukrainian situation?
Well, first of all, leave it out with the pacifist nonsense, right? You can't be making arms and then claiming a pacifist state, right? The reality is your government has all these laws in place to govern the sales of arms and who they want to sell arms to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So leave it out with the pacifist nonsense, right? You can say, violence isn't your preferred form of resolution. I'm cool with that, but don't claim pacifist. Look, the reality is that Ukraine is too close to Germany to allow political instability, especially because it neighbors too many countries near Germany, to allow that political instability. And if Russia takes up even more imperialistic attitude, because I think it is displaying an imperialistic attitude towards its ex-satellite nations and states, then that creates real problems. You already see some of that in the moves or the tightening of relationship between Russia and Hungary, I believe it is. Where's Orban president of? I think it's Hungary. Anyway, one of these ex-Soviet nations. But you see the tightening of the relationships between them when they have been quite distant at one point. You see it in the fact that part of Ukraine has already been invaded.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think there's a lot to be concerned about in terms of the people in the Ukraine. I think that's more who I'm worried about. Germany is worried about it from a perspective of how does it affect me economically.
Yeah.
I also think they might be also aware of the fact that this could exacerbate the refugee numbers coming into their country.
Yeah.
Because they're not only dealing with people coming from North Africa, from the Middle East and those areas. Now they'll be dealing with refugees coming in from
kind of the Polish border where we were having this crisis before.
Yeah, and I think what we need to be aware of is that is actually a destabilizing technique. Right. So this when you see what Russia's doing, it's actually a concerted effort to destabilize
the region,
the nations that are around it. And of course, what it does is then say, well, we'll come in and help. No, what you mean is you're gonna take your foot off my neck, and
Come in and control my whole
when I
body.
breathe again,
You're
you
in charge
know,
of the whole
and then
system.
when I'm finally allowed to breathe again, I'm gonna find that actually, no, you've just hogtied me. You know? Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, I'd be seriously concerned about some of Russia's actions and attitudes. Um, I think Germany has the ability to affect them
Yeah.
because they haven't turned on the gas pipeline yet.
Yeah. Precisely.
Um, and I think one other thing to really say is that nobody's really put real sanctions on Russia, right? Nobody has really put real sanctions on Putin, personal sanctions on Putin, seized his assets or anything like that. And when you contrast this to what Europe and the British did to Mugabe in
Oh, well.
Zimbabwe,
Mm.
right? You need to really ask, well, what's the difference here?
Oh, it's also what they did to
Listen, I could go
Hussein.
through a list. They did it to Mugabe, they did it to Gaddafi, they did it to pretty much every leader of color that did not toe their line. If they
Yeah.
couldn't overthrow them, they placed sanctions on the country and personal sanctions. The
Right.
sanctions on the country were to destabilize the country in the hope that people would then overthrow
Their
the leader,
government themselves. Yeah.
and then they'd install a puppet that they were happy with.
And
Yeah,
then when the
so
puppet steps out of hand, we get the same system back again. Oh, it is it's disturbing. It's just it is really disturbing. I think the reason it disturbs me is because we've seen this in history before, you know. This this was the start of the World War II. It feels very reminiscent to the history that we've learned in Europe about how World War II started, with this whole, well, we're sort of dealing with you, we're kind of not liking what you're behaving like, but you know, if we could just negotiate with you a little bit. Meanwhile, the force themselves is quite willing to kill everybody in any way, one in its way, to get what it wants. And then once it becomes a snowball, then we're like, oh, we should have done something about it, and now we're all in world war. And I think for someone who, you know, had to study world war history at school as you did, who had to really learn about all of these things, you see the parallels so easily, and it does feel quite scary that we could be back there, because we know this is not like what they do to brown leaders. What happens to
listen, I'm
white
just
leaders
like,
goes slightly differently.
the reality is, you need to ask yourself the question. They're all the way in Syria trying to force democracy down Assad's throat and the Syrian people's throat.
Oh
Meanwhile, Russia
no.
does not have democracy. Syria did not invade another country in
And
violation of
honestly,
how many UN laws and charters, right?
mm-hmm.
Russia has.
Yeah.
But you're still not there trying to force democracy down Russian throats.
Amazing, that amazing. It's amazing. The
Yeah.
yeah, it's amazing. Someone's just Shireen helping us out. Meanwhile, yes, meanwhile, indeed. Oh dear. Right. Well, enough of what seems like doom and gloom news, and down to the real issue that we're going to talk about today, what you've tuned in for. We are talking about the intersection of misogyny, racism, and police violence today. There is an ongoing story that was being written. The story lasts about 10 years, so you have to bear with me as I establish the facts so that we can get into the meat of the discussion. So let's go. The Met Police, which is the police for London, have apologised to a woman for sexist, derogatory language in a strip search. They have paid compensation. Okay, so the woman in question, her name is Dr. Constancy Duff. I hope I've pronounced her name correctly. She's an academic, a professor of philosophy at the University of Nottingham, and she writes and has a book actually, which I want to read now that I found it. It's on the politics of police abolition. She's an advocate, and she goes into neighborhoods when they are doing stop and search sweeps, and she hands out cards to young Black men who are being affected, so that they can know their rights. So that's her way of doing activism. Now, on this day, which was on the 5th of May 2013, she was arrested on suspicion of obstructing and assaulting a police officer. And the act that she had done was handed, as I said, a legal advice card. And this time it was to a 15-year-old who was caught up in a stop and search sweep in Hackney. So, of course, you know that she works in Nottingham, so she does this specifically, but she was in Hackney. She was taken to Stoke Newington police station. She was her arresting officer was Sergeant Curtis Howard at the police station. Now, she has been cleared of those charges. So those charges are clear. She's gone to Stoke Newington police station. For anyone who is from Hackney, London, and knows Stoke Newington police station, this is going to get rough. You know this. But basically, Howard was taken in 2018 before a disciplinary panel and was cleared of gross misconduct, even though the records show that he is said saying resistance is futile, you do this by any means necessary to his officers, treat her like she's a terrorist, I don't care what you do, strip search this woman. And what was the crime she had committed that warranted a strip search? Remember, she had handed a card to a 15-year-old caught up in stop and search, and then subsequently refused to give her name, which she legally doesn't have to do. So she's well within her legal rights because she's the one handing out the legal cards, and they decide that for their own safety, and they find him not guilty of gross misconduct. If you read the full transcript, your stomach will turn, so I don't advise you doing that. But basically, 3 female officers then bind her up, hands and feet, pin her down to the ground, cut her clothes off, perform a search, which leaves her looking, she's covered in injuries that leave her looking like she's been sexually assaulted, which if you look like you've been sexually assaulted, can I just say, then you probably have been sexually assaulted. But that, just because they say it's under the guise of a strip search, does not seem to be. Anyway, maybe I stick to the facts of the story and you can bring in these comments afterwards. A conversation about her body that goes on afterwards is stomach-churningly disgusting. So the 3 female officers then are being watched and supervised by male officers. They're talking in the gangway. They're talking about her. They're talking to her. They're talking about she's rank. And my stomach just kind of went sick when I read it because it was just awful. And to think that there were women and men involved in that conversation is even more disgusting. But the CCTV evidence, because this was all CCTV, so they recorded everything. It's not like they turned off the cameras. You know, the police are often accused of turning them off. They were brazenly doing this with all the cameras on. What they said in the case was that it really exposes the culture of sexualized mockery and dehumanizing attitudes. The racism, misogyny, and sexual violence are normalized within policing. And they do this and so we will know how they do this. You could probably explain this quite easily. They basically end up scrutinizing the victim so that they can blame the victim for escalating their own actions. So instead of you looking at why are you behaving like that towards this woman? This is out of proportion. This is disgusting. Who thought you this? What they do is they victim blame, they gaslight, and they say, well, she was not cooperating, she was not doing this. Look at her history, and they start to do that kind of behavior. This case is to the backdrop, of course, of a number of cases for the Met Police. They have actually, I should have written down her name, they have actually brought in a woman to deal with misogyny in policing, but notice they're dealing with misogyny in policing and not racism. Can we just note that there is a woman at the head of the Met Police? So you want to deal with misogyny in policing? There is a woman, Cressida Dick, Dame Cressida Dick, if you dare.
Dick by name, Dick by nature.
Who's at the head of this. This is a real intersection of race, gender, and policing. And I say that because the woman in question is a white woman. It's not a black woman that's doing this, it's a white woman. And she ends up with all of this happening to her. It's quite something. I'm gonna pause. I'm gonna just bring in the context. So in this last year alone, alongside this case now being resolved, we've had the rape and murder of Sarah Everard by Wayne Couzens, a police officer, which when they decided to investigate the Met after that, it said that the Met is institutionally misogynistic. So we'll add that to the institutionally racist. There is also the case of Bieber Henry and Nicole Smallman, who in 2020 were murdered, and the police did nothing. It said they actually didn't follow one instance of their own policy. In fact, treated these two black women like they were suspicious and were warranting to be investigated for criminal actions, not for the missing persons that they were. So they were declared missing. And what hit me in the gut about that story is that because the police failed, the friends organized their own search party, and they were the ones that found the murdered sisters. I mean, I can't imagine finding my friend's murdered body and having to process and deal with that because the police completely failed this woman and these families. So go, because
also in that, let's not forget that there were police officers that were disciplined because they were taking pictures of the bodies and then leaking them and passing them around, etc., 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 that risk contaminating the crime scene in order to take these pictures. It was just completely dehumanizing. There's another police officer that was arrested for rape.
Yep.
Maybe about
I mean, the
6 weeks
litany
ago,
is
maybe.
huge, but this is
The amount of police officers in the past year or so charged with child pornography charges and things like that, it's insane.
yep.
Right. But first of all, Stokey Police Station. Let me tell you something, right? Stokey is a cesspit of corruption, right? I know people, right? The police will grab them off the street, take them down, because at Stokey Police Station, the cells used to be underground. They would take them down there, they would beat them, give them drugs to sell, and then tell them, we know where you live if you don't sell these. Right? That's Stokey Police Station. Right?
So Stoke Newington, for those of you that are not from London, they call it Stokey. It's an area of Hackney, London, which
So when you say to me Stoke Newington and police station, I automatically go biblical and think Bethlehem. Ain't nothing good coming out of there. Right? That's just the reality of it all.
Yeah.
As for bringing in a woman to investigate misogyny in the police force, you have a woman in charge. Look, let's be real, right? Whoever they bring in is just going to whitewash the whole thing. We talking about, if we were to put it in racial terms, they'd be a house end. Right? That's the reality of it. They're going to be snitching or doing whatever they have to keep their privilege and position and power. Doesn't matter the fact that they're being abused in the process. They just know they don't have it as bad as, right? So the fact that women will also be present and be taking part in the abuse in this is not surprising, because the reality is, if they don't, they will be the ones subject to that abuse.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
right?
Yeah, it's disgusting.
Look, I have no love for the police, none whatsoever. I'm just going to put it straight out there, so you know where my position on police is. But I do have people that I know that work for the police, right? I know there's one that I know that used to work, they might still do, work for Operation Trident, which was meant to investigate black on black crime, right? And they used to tell me story after story after story of the racism that would take place at work on a daily basis.
Yeah.
The racist things that will be said, the racist things that will be done. So I'm not surprised by any of this.
No.
Um, so the racism aspect, yeah, that's all there. As for the misogyny, as I said, I can understand why women will be caught up in this. It's not to excuse the behavior of the female police officers, but I
No.
also understand it. You know,
Well, it's
um,
conditioning, isn't it? It's also
it is,
conditioning.
but it gets to a point where some people, you're tired of getting hit and kicked. You're like, okay, there's somebody else to hit and kick.
Yeah.
You just had
Condition.
enough of it yourself. So
Yeah.
let's find another target so that I don't get hit and kicked anymore. Um, I think also we need to deal with the fact that this woman's whiteness could not protect her because she
Oh,
is an N lover, right?
this I really wanted to talk on this aspect of the intersection. So talk on it, because I really want to talk on this.
Well, I think we need to recognize that when it comes to whiteness, so let's take the Jim Crow laws, for example. They were meant to set laws to normalize certain social behaviors that would place um, white people in a hierarchy at the top, and it, it was effectively to dehumanize black people. And when white people would break those social terms and constructs, that social contract that white people have amongst themselves, they
Mm.
will be labeled an N lover.
Mm-hmm.
And what this woman did by telling these young black men and giving them the card was to break that social contract that she had with her
Mm-hmm.
fellow white people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
She now becomes an N lover, and in doing so,
Mm-hmm.
forfeits any of the privileges and protections that her whiteness would have normally afforded her.
Mm-hmm.
But we also have to have the conversation that from her surname, I don't think she was Anglo-Saxon white. And that
Cool. From her
further
birth
muddies the waters, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So
she's a
that
redhead. She's very, very white looking, if that helps you.
yes, but even so, her name,
Listen,
once you
whiteness is
find
a
out
very
her name,
fluid thing. Listen,
right,
whiteness
and
is a very fluid thing. If you don't
right,
think that whiteness is a fluid thing, come live in Europe and then I'll show you the fluidity of whiteness, yeah?
right, and especially when you're dealing with whiteness in an English context, the Anglo-Saxons, and I'm saying England specifically because there's the Anglo-Saxon whiteness in which they other the Irish, the Scottish, everyone else. So this woman within the English context of whiteness would have been othered,
Right.
right? So you're dealing with that as well. So she's white when they want her to be white, but it's subjective. It can be stripped away. It's a transitory thing. So the
So,
minute,
and I want to pause here because I think this is where people don't understand the systemic nature of racism and whiteness and why that needs to be unpacked. The fact that a white person can be stripped of their whiteness, you can just magically not be white anymore and they can subject you to that, is the fact that there is a system in place. It is transactional. It only benefits whiteness, and that really has to be unpacked for people. I think that's for me, it's such a sticking point because people always want to be turning myself inside out to define what blackness is, And I'm not really concerned with that. I'm more concerned with the definition of whiteness, because that affects everything else. And if we don't unpack that and sort that mess out, we're all going to be suffering forever. Like, sort that out first. That's my little
Yeah, so
chicken two
as I
pennies.
said, there's yeah, she was just always going to be up against it. But when you brought this story to me, actually, you wanted to take it into the direction of the intersectionality between gender and race, where actually I looked at this story and my first thought actually in the story is, what does it mean to be an ally?
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And for me, I wanted to give this woman her flowers, and say, look, when it comes to being an ally, this is what it sometimes takes, and the sacrifices that are
Yeah.
necessary.
Yeah.
So yeah, I just want to acknowledge her actions, her
Yeah.
sacrifice, and give her her flowers.
Yeah. Respect where respect is due. And this isn't just her one-off incident. This is a consistent way of life for this woman. She writes, she has a book on abolition of policing. This is her life's work, so to speak, and she didn't do it just in theory, but she got down in the dirt with the people, so to speak, and was on the front lines of this with this young child. There is a child at the center of this, after all. There's a 15-year-old boy who's caught up in a stop and search. He's a child. He's being stopped and searched, and stop and search powers in the UK are
Right.
not.
So let me give you some statistics on that. Right. So between January 21 to December 21, 90,474 white people were stopped by the Metropolitan Police. 80,994 black people were stopped by the police, Met Police. Yeah, you heard me right.
I'm sorry.
38,554 Asian people were stopped by the police. And then there's 13,868 other. And this is based on the ethnic appearance of how the Met thought they appeared ethnically. This isn't their own designation.
So I really want to. This was 2021
Yeah.
in the
The
pandemic
figures are for up till the end of December 2021. So these are the most recent figures from the Met Police.
in a lockdown.
Yes.
So when large parts of the year were spent during lockdown, you still managed to find 80,000 black people and 30,000 Asian people to stop and search.
Well, let's
You
say
have a
40
problem.
because it's 38,000. However, what I want to
How?
also give you is the positive outcomes. In other words, the stop and searches in which they found something illegal, some contraband on the people.
What, all 10
So
of them?
24,475 for white people, 21,255 for black people, 10,084 for Asian people, and 3,462 for other. Right? So what I want you to understand here is, because you talked about the stop and search and just how bad it is in London, is that when you look at the rates for which illegal contraband was found on people, they're actually very comparable between black and white. The percentage.
Yeah, I mean,
Right?
90,000 you stopped
But
white people,
to be honest,
25,000,
it's actually slightly lower for black people.
Yeah.
Right? But when you look at the proportionality in population for the search, it's insane.
What is the current percentage of the population that black people make up in the UK? Because it's still single digits, right? We're not in double
Yes, it's something like 6% or something like that of
Okay,
people
so
in
let's just
the
put that in
UK.
proportion. So the 90% of white people, you ain't stopping, but you managed to find the 6% quite easily. and stop them on a regular basis. No, listen, I grew up in Stop and Search era when it was introduced in Hackney. It was not pretty. There was nothing good about it. Nothing good came of it. All that came of it was the abuse, the criminalization of young black boys, particularly, and just their treatment, just as the dehumanizing treatment of particularly young black boys. And I use boys deliberately because oftentimes we're talking about minors. This case particularly highlights that. It was a 15-year-old. These are not grown adults that you're stopping and searching.
No. Yeah, I did have the statistics on age demographics as well. It was, I think 15 to 18 was the second highest age demographic, and the highest was 20 to 24.
So basically, just young people then. Only people
Yeah.
that commit crimes in the UK are black young people. Listen, this anyway.
Right.
Stop and search
But
files. Let me not get
but you know,
sidetracked.
that's an aside. That's just to say and show how bad stop and search in the UK is.
And that's the reason why this woman does what she does.
Yes.
This is why she has these cards. This is why she's not the only one. There are many people throughout the community who are campaigning, supporting, standing with young people when they get stopped. That if you just look up Stop and Search in the UK, you will see video after video of campaigners, just innocent people, bystanders, just getting involved because they see how the young boys, children, are being treated. And they're often, we say young people, but they're also often children.
Yeah, and so we're speaking about the woman, we're speaking about the intersectionality of race and misogyny, or race and gender. And we've given the example of this lecture, but I also want to talk about another educator in the field, because it might seem, or people might say, oh, that was a one-off. Well, I'll give you the name of another educator, just that you can go and look at their story, and that is Jane Elliott.
Oh,
right? And I want to read you a quote about what she said. So, for those that don't know, she did the brown eyes, blue eyes experiment. And I just want to read you a quote about what she says about that, because it highlights the price that she had to pay and just how great that price was. Okay. So she says, in relation to the experiment, I didn't know how this exercise would work. If I had known how it would work, I probably wouldn't have done it. If I had known that our 4 children would be spit on and their belongings would be destroyed, that they will be verbally and physically abused by their peers, by their teachers, and some of the parents of their peers, because they had what that community labeled as an N-word lover for a mother. Right? And that was a direct cost that she paid, right? But on top of that, because of the work that she had done, her parents lost their business. They owned a restaurant, and people boycotted her parents' restaurant because of the work that she'd done. Jane Elliott was ostracized by her fellow peers, teachers within the education system. Her husband, she talks about how her husband lost his social network because of the work that she did, right? And so what you see then here is that once you step out into these areas, once you are labeled an N lover or do something to promote justice, the typical things that will protect you no longer do. So, for example, her whiteness no longer protected her or her family, right? But the great thing that they love to fall back on, or people love to fall back on, is how can you do this to a woman? It's a woman, but she's received death threats.
Yeah.
So neither her race nor her gender could protect her.
Nope.
She's had people physically threaten her want to fight her, you know? And yet, you know, we are where we are. She's still doing the work.
She is. I mean, I remember watching an interview of hers, and I will never forget watching her recount. She had been invited to speak in a school district, and the racist mob had found out. And the night before, it had garnered so big that the school district had to call in the police and work out an escape route for this woman out of the state. Not just like out of the neighborhood, out of the state in which she had been invited to just be the speaker to do her education work. And they had to plan a route for her and try and figure out how to get her bypassed police, because of course police were involved in this. That's how institutional the problems are in the States, that they could also be in the white mob, and how to get this woman out of the state so she could get safely back home. And that's not to mention all of the people that I know, these stories, as we talked about today, this is one incident in the UK, but there are many incidents where this happens, where people stand with someone who is of color, and then their treatment is shocking and horrendous, but shocking and horrendous because, oh, hold on, but you're white. Normally you wouldn't get treated like that. How come that's happening to you? Oh, because you're with a person of color and they're treating you like them. That's the treatment. And I think Jane Elliott's question she always poses to a group of white people when she does the education is the question I guess we could kind of end on this discussion, which is, for everyone in the room, who would be happy to receive the treatment of Black people? That's the question she always ends on. And of course, no one ever puts up their hand, because no one wants to be treated that way, because everyone knows what's happening. Everyone is really aware of the racism that goes on. Everyone's aware of the treatment. They just don't want to rock the boat and be treated in that way.
I think I would adapt the question slightly, considering the subject that we're talking about, and ask, for those in the room, to raise your hand if you will be happy to be treated like a Black woman.
And there will be silence. Yeah. Well, on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on the dark side. Thank you for being here with us. We appreciate your support and your continued questions and interaction. I think that question even hit me quite hard. I think that question kind of hit me hard. I'm almost derailed a little bit. So there's some upcoming topics that we hope to be talking about over the coming time. We're going to talk about race and mental health. And then we're going to talk about gender-based violence. There's a study done in Kenya about some stuff that's going on there. So there shall be some of that coming up in future episodes.
Okay. No, I was just thinking there's a relevant news story that came out today regarding a footballer and domestic violence. So.
Yes, indeed. So yes, and these are about domestic violence. The Kenyan is about domestic violence, particularly, and so we'll be looking at domestic violence in coming episodes. Thank you so much for joining us. Do you want to say anything before I put on our end credits?
No, I'm good.
All right, so folks, thank you so much for joining us. Let the question sit with you heavily. Even as a Black woman, would you be willing to be treated as a Black woman? And then when you wrestle with that, you really have to work out where we are in the world, I guess. Wrestle away.
Portuguese goods.
Oh yeah, boycott Portuguese goods. Indeed. Righty, so we are going to put our end credits on, and we'll see you next week on the dark side.